We've been talking about Sri Lanka working with international creditors, the Paris Club, and other bilateral creditors in order to secure financial debt assurances as a precursor to obtain the International Monetary Fund, EFF, of $2.9 billion. We've been awaiting assurances from both India and China. Earlier last week, we heard from India. We saw a letter that India had sent to the IMF, and just days back, China too extended their support to Sri Lanka and extended their support in terms of a 2-year moratorium for Sri Lanka's debt to the country. I've invited to our studios to talk more on the question of China and how Sri Lanka can work to enhance relations with China, at the same time balance other powers. Sri Lankan Ambassador to China, Dr. Palitha Kohona. A very warm welcome to you. Ayubowan.
Happy to be here, Ayubowan.
Ayubowan. Thank you very much, Dr. Kohona, for being here. You're briefly visiting Sri Lanka, but tell us how the response is from Chinese authorities. There has been a bit of controversy in how Sri Lanka is going to treat the outstanding debt of China. The Chinese Exim Bank has lent Sri Lanka some $2.83 billion, which is about 3.5% of total Sri Lankan debt. But you've continuously said Sri Lanka's debt to China is less than 10% of overall debt. What is the status of the outstanding debt that is to be dealt with? And will China work with the International Monetary Fund as per information and engagements you've had with the authorities there, Dr. Kohona?
China has said publicly that it will work with Sri Lanka in addressing Sri Lanka's financial problems. And I have no doubt that they will do it with all sincerity. So the details are not available to us at this stage as to what has happened in the discussions with our financial people and the Chinese financial people. But I'm confident that China will comply, will stay with what it has already said in public, which is basically that they will work with Sri Lanka in addressing Sri Lanka's difficult financial situation.
There have been questions about treating China as an equal creditor of the island, that there be equitable debt treatment. Why are these controversies? Where are they coming from? There is fear among the Indians and the Americans that China will have the upper hand in obtaining advantage over Sri Lanka's situation. Has there been any demands?
How much advantage can China have in this situation? China, we owe only about 10% of our external debt to China. We owe much more to international financial institutions. So what is the advantage that China can get in this situation?
Asking Sri Lanka to deal with China and other creditors fairly, do you think there have been any requests from the Chinese side to you or any other authorities?
No, but there's been no request to act in a particular manner or not act in a particular manner. We know that Sri Lankan financial authorities are talking to the Chinese financial authorities, and we expect that some resolution will be reached sooner or later.
Just days back, China did say through China's Exim Bank that they will provide support to Sri Lanka's bailout package. Now, this also comes with a 2-year moratorium, debt moratorium. With that, do you think China will be wary of lending Sri Lanka more funds where necessary?
That remains to be seen, because we do not know where we will come out of all these talks. And then, of course, there are some very hard negotiations to be pursued. So let's hope that the negotiations will result in an outcome that is satisfactory from Sri Lanka's perspective.
China has been a major partner of infrastructure development and investments. Going forward, do you see China working or collaborating with Sri Lanka for new projects, given that Sri Lanka is managing and has to deal with this debt issue and requiring assurances from other countries?
There are two elements here. One is state-to-state funding provided by China. And in the area of infrastructure, in the past, China has extended a considerable amount of funding and assistance to Sri Lanka to build roads, highways, harbors, airports, etc. Then there is also the private sector investment. Previously, that was not a major part of Chinese funding flowing into Sri Lanka, but in the future, we hope that private sector investment will play a big role, because China now has considerable amount of surplus investment capacity. It also has expertise in a large number of areas. I have been around China and I've seen their technological prowess. So now the effort is to encourage Chinese companies to invest in Sri Lanka, so that there will be industrial investment undertaken by Chinese in Sri Lanka, not only to supply the local market, but also to supply the regional market, and perhaps even supply China itself. China is becoming a relatively expensive place to manufacture certain items, and it will be in the interests of Chinese companies to make use of a location like Sri Lanka to produce for the Chinese market, in addition, of course, to the other markets that they already supply. Mm-hmm. So this is an area that we will be focusing on, encouraging Chinese companies, especially the bigger companies, to invest in Sri Lanka for production facilities to supply the global market from Sri Lanka.
Mm-hmm. Has there been any interest or already projects ongoing, discussions ongoing related to that?
I must say that we have been discussing with a number of Chinese companies about the possibility of producing solar panels in Sri Lanka, steel in Sri Lanka, fertilizer in Sri Lanka, etc. But these discussions have not reached their final stages, and I hope that we will be able to encourage many Chinese companies to locate their offshore facilities in Sri Lanka.
Mm-hmm. Just last year, we ended close to 750,000 tourists throughout the entire year, which is far less than what we'd expect, but better than anticipated, given the challenges Sri Lanka faced amidst an economic crisis, a fuel crisis. But China is now open. No restrictions, COVID-related restrictions. So how do you assess the potential for the growth of Chinese travel market in Sri Lanka?
China was, before 2020 to in 2019, the biggest source of tourists in the world. 169 million Chinese traveled somewhere. Unfortunately, at the time, we received only about 265,000 tourists. Absolutely inadequate compared with 26 million Chinese tourists in Thailand, 4.5 million in Singapore, 2.5 million in Australia, despite the tensions between China and Australia. Okay. We should have received more, and now we are working very hard at the embassy to encourage Chinese to think of Sri Lanka as their primary destination for their holidays. If we can get even a fraction of the Chinese who intend to travel this year and the next year, I think many of our problems will be resolved.
Many of our problems will be resolved.
Yeah.
But what's really keeping the Chinese tourists away from Sri Lanka? If they travel so much, so in such large numbers back in 2019, what did we not do to attract that number to Sri Lanka?
I think that's a very interesting question, and we need to examine where we faltered. My personal views are there, but I think we need to promote Sri Lanka more, promote it as a friendly destination, a destination where they can come with themselves and with their families and take back happy memories. I think traditionally Sri Lanka focused on the European market, and that market is very different to a Chinese market. Just to give you one example, Chinese are not particularly attracted to the beaches. Chinese like to keep their skins light rather than tanned. So we need to move away from that Europe-based promotion of Sri Lanka to a different way of promoting Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka has high mountains covered with tea, and the Chinese love our tea. We have gems and jewelry, which are very popular with the Chinese. Then, of course, we have the historic religious connection with China, the Buddhist connection. And wherever I had traveled, and I've traveled to 16 provinces, there is an urge to travel somewhere. Now that China has opened up, thousands of Chinese, hundreds of thousands, will immediately head to some destination overseas. And what we need to do is to promote Sri Lanka from the perspective of the Chinese and get them to come here as their preferred destination. And as you know, China at state level has listed 20 countries for Chinese tourists to travel to, Chinese groups to travel to. And then Sri Lanka is one of them. So out of the 20 listed, Sri Lanka is one of them. And I'm very pleased that our efforts have paid off to some extent. But now we can't rest on our laurels. We'll have to work harder to ensure that thousands of Chinese tourists will visit Sri Lanka and spend the yuan or dollars or whatever they have in this country, so that the hotels will be filled up again and employment will be generated, and most importantly, foreign exchange will flow into our exchequer. I would also like to mention that we are in the middle of the Chinese New Year. The year of the rabbit is just about to begin, and thousands, millions of Chinese will travel at this time to visit their families or on holiday. So I take this opportunity to wish all my Chinese friends a very happy New Year and a prosperous year of the rabbit. Tunyang Kwaila.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kohona, for your time here at our studios.
Thank you very much for this opportunity.
We had with us Dr. Palitha Kohona, Ambassador of Sri Lanka in Beijing, joining us here in Colombo during a brief visit to the country.